Good afternoon and welcome to our latest lecture in our series this semester on race, myths, and realities. We're very pleased today to be able to welcome Professor Gordon Chang from Stanford University, who is kind enough to give us some of his time today, and we're grateful for that. Let me just make a couple of announcements. As you're aware, the Kennedy Center has a lot of events, lectures, and other events. We invite you to check them out on our website where you'll find information, but also to follow us on Facebook and Instagram where you can receive more information. I just want to highlight a couple of events that are coming up in the next week. One of them, tomorrow, we will have an additional lecture by I should say an additional lecture on our theme of race, our semester-long theme, by Dr. LaShawn Williams, who's a professor of social work at Utah Valley University. And she's going to be discussing how members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints can build a better future of race relations. And I will put some information in the chat about that, and also that our International Society Conference is next Tuesday and Wednesday. Keynote speakers will include Elder Jeffrey Holland, Reverend Andrew Teal, who is a chaplain and fellow in theology at Pembroke College in Oxford, and Melissa Inouye, senior lecturer at the University of Auckland. And so anyway, you'll find, I'll give you the link for further information about that as well, but both well worth checking out. We will begin, as is our custom at BYU, with an opening prayer, which will be offered by Ethan Fong, who is an Asian Studies major from American Fork, Utah. And following that, our speaker will be introduced by Eric Heyer, who's a professor of political science and the coordinator of our Asian Studies program. So Ethan, please unmute yourself and offer the prayer.
Our Father in heaven, we are grateful for this day, and we're grateful for the opportunity that we have to be gathered here. We're grateful for Dr. Chang and his willingness to come here and to lecture to us. We pray that as we listen to him, that we can learn both from his words and from the Spirit, just more about the lived experience of Asian Americans and Chinese Americans in the United States, that it will give us a greater understanding and empathy for their lives and for their current experiences. We pray, as always, for those that are struggling from the pandemic around the world and from economic fallout, and we pray for them that they can be blessed and strengthened during this difficult time. Father, we love thee so very much, and we're grateful for all of thy many blessings, and we say these things in the name of thy Son, Jesus Christ. Amen.
So Eric, go ahead and turn some time over to you to introduce our speaker.
I'm Eric Heyer. I'm the coordinator for Asian Studies. I'm so happy to be able to welcome Gordon Chang to BYU today to give this lecture. Over the past year, the consistent escalation of violence against Asian Americans, and then the very tragic events in Atlanta a few weeks ago with the killing of 8 people, 6 of them Asian American women, only underscores the dilemma we face with racism in America, the topic of this semester. So I'm very happy to have Gordon Chang here, and his lecture today is very relevant in that he will help us understand more a larger historical context of Asian Americans in American life. Professor Chang is a professor of history at Stanford University. He received his bachelor's degree from Princeton University and his PhD from Harvard. He's interested in several different areas of history, including the historical connections between race and ethnicity in America on the one hand and foreign relations on the other. He's written and continues to publish in areas of U.S. diplomacy, America-China relations, the Chinese diaspora, Asian American history, and global history. His recent research has examined the history of Chinese railroad workers in America, which he'll talk about today in the 19th century. He co-directs a very interesting international project that seeks to recover the history of Chinese railroad workers in North America. Professor Chang teaches courses on America-China relations and also a very interesting course on the Asian American movement, a history of activism. He has many publications. These include Fateful Ties, a history of America's preoccupation with China, Chinese American Voices, Asian Americans and Politics, Perspectives, Experiences, and Prospects. And his most recent book, published in 2019, is Ghosts of Gold Mountain, the epic story of Chinese who built the Transcontinental Railroad. I'm really happy to welcome Professor Chang to BYU today. Thank you for coming.
Well, thank you. Am I on now, Professor Benfeld? And
You are on.
All
Yes,
right. Well, thank you
yes.
for that
Yeah, we
lovely
can hear you.
introduction. I wish I could be there in person with you. I see a lot of names, a few faces, few of you are live. But I hope you all have a chance to look at some screens, because I do have a number of slides to present to you. Before I get into the lecture, I can make I always like to make connections with audiences. I think Professor Benfeld mentioned Jeffrey Holland. He's a former president of BYU. Is that the? So
Yes, that's correct.
I think I mentioned this to Professor Benfeld before, but I believe Jeffrey Holland's son, David, was a student of mine at Stanford. So he got his PhD in U.S. history and religion a few years ago. Now he's at Harvard, and very fond memories of working with David. So that's like a 3-degree separation from you all, or something like that. Well, there's a lot to talk about, and Professor Heyer and Ethan mentioned recent events and the terrible events, and we could talk about them maybe at the end. But when I was invited to give this talk, of course, that event hadn't happened yet, or these events hadn't happened. So, but they are certainly in our minds and are in our context. So what I'm going to speak about today is about the railroad workers who were from China, who completed the western portion of the Transcontinental Railroad. So I'm going to share my screen here, and hopefully this will all work. All right. And I think that's what you see?
Yep.
Okay, good. So I'm not sure if this is, I should do this. All right. Well, maybe I should go. All right, I'll do this as a presenter.
Yeah, that looks great.
Okay, so now I'm going to start off with these slides. We talk about current events, and I think we probably are familiar with this. Is this fascinating story that seems to be winding down now, because the evergreen given is now floating away. But this ship is unbelievable. I mean, in size, if you can see in the lower left-hand corner, right-hand corner here, the size of these large machines, and they're just dwarfed by this ship, which is about the length of the height of the Empire State Building. Now, why is all this interesting? Because the Suez Canal was completed within months of the Transcontinental Railroad. The Transcontinental Railroad and the Suez Canal, it can be argued, made the world a world. That is, before these things were completed, travel, the shipment of goods and people around the world was very, very difficult and time-consuming and dangerous. And after these two mega construction projects, the biggest construction projects to date in human history, and still stand as epic moments, have transformed our world and become really quite dependent upon them. As the Suez Canal, we know, can't get the stuff from IKEA. But the two complete projects made possible a famous novel. Some of you may have read, some of you may have seen the movie, which is a bit outdated, but it's still a good movie, I think. It's called Around the World in 80 Days. It was based on a story by Jules Verne, who read about the completion of the Suez Canal through Egypt and the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad when he was having a cup of coffee and a croissant or something in a Paris cafe. And it piqued his curiosity, his interest. And he said, now what was the implication of these two projects? And he realized that now it made possible, someone could travel around the world. It made possible to conceive of the world as one unit. These projects here to Transcontinental Railroad fundamentally transformed notions of time, space, and distance. Time, space, and distance. We think those are given, but they really are variable in the sense of how they're lived, how they're felt, how they're overcome. Time, space, and distance. So that when you have, like obviously if you're in a car, you're going a lot faster than a horse, and that changes the sense of time, space, and distance, and your proximity or your distance from anybody, anything else, fundamentally. So we live in modern times with very much compressed time, space, and distance, but in some ways you could say that really hastened after the completion of these two projects. And so that story is about a Englishman who leaves the UK and then has a bet with some others that he can circumnavigate the Earth, globe, within 80 days, which seemed to be impossible at the time in the 1870s when the story takes place. And he's able to do so just by the nick of time. He makes it all the way around the world because he takes advantage of these two projects, the Suez Canal, and as you can see, going across the United States. Now, if you, for a moment, think about the world without those two projects, without the Suez Canal, without the Transcontinental Railroad, and what route somebody would have taken to go around the world. So he would have gone down the coast of France, Spain, and all the way down to Cape of Good Hope, to southern Africa, and come all the way back up instead of cutting through as he did. Then he's got to get to Asia, the Far East, which is by ship and was commonly done already by that time, and then across the long Pacific, which he does, and stopping in Hawaiian Islands and so forth. And then he would have to hit the so-called New World. And how do you get across the New World? Now, the New World, if you go from New York to San Francisco or vice versa, there were at that time, before the Transcontinental Railroad, 3 routes to get across the continent. And each route would take somewhere between 6 to 8 weeks at best, 6 to 8 weeks, or you could die along the way because it was quite perilous. So you would take the overland route, let's go from San Francisco to New York, and you would go, there was a bit of a train from Oakland to Sacramento, but then you'd have to basically walk the rest of the way, or take a horse or a covered wagon or something, go along till you got to Ogden, Omaha, Nebraska. And then you could take a train in the eastern part of the country. That was one route, but that was dangerous, time consuming, because you had to cross Native American lands, which were still considered sovereign in their eyes, and they were resisting the encroachments of others into their historic territories. You also had the terrible vagaries of weather going through the Sierra Nevada, not far away from many of you, and you may know or should know about the tragic Donner Party that went from east to west and got caught in an early snowstorm in the eastern portion of the Sierra, and got trapped and descended after depleting their supplies, descended into cannibalism. I mean, that's always the story of quite a drama. And if you go to around Lake Tahoe, that area there, you find a lot of the names, Donner Summit, Donner Lake, and that's to memorialize that tragic party. The other route you can take, the second route, is to go down to Panama. It's on the map here, you can see Colombia just above Colombia, and have to walk across the isthmus there. There was no Panama Canal yet. And then wait for another ship to come up on the Atlantic side to take you to New York. And in Panama was tropical and full of malaria and other diseases. And one of the early leaders of the Central Pacific Railroad, a man named Theodore Judah, was sent by the directors of the railroad to New York to raise funds for the railroad capital. He went through that route, contracted disease, and died. So that shows you how dangerous that route was. Or the third route, you'd go all the way down the tip of South America and come all the way back up again, which was all three dangerous, they're very time consuming, laborious, and costly. Railroad transformed that 6 to 8 week venture into 6 to 8 days. And it could go safely, quickly, rather less expensive, and then you could transport in great amounts of goods, including strawberries from California that would come out to Utah, or mining iron ore and coal and timber from the West to the Midwest and manufacturing centers. And it could bring immigrants and from the East to West. And I would bet some of you on this call, if you were from in Utah, that some of your predecessors took that route to come out West. So that was the enormous change of that. But we don't think of the Transcontinental Railroad often in these global terms. And that's what I'm trying to do today, is to talk about these in global terms. Here's another map. You can see what I just talked about. And you're just a little bit south of, well, I guess where the Great Salt Lake wording is that's where you are now in BYU. But you can see the two railroad lines linked together at Promontory Summit in 1869, May 1869. The Union Pacific coming from Omaha and the Central Pacific from Sacramento. The Union Pacific was, the workforce was largely Irish immigrant and African-American freed people, Civil War veterans, and Mormons. And that's it's a story which still has to be really understood. From going from east to west, west to east is the Central Pacific Railroad. And that was, the workforce was 90% Chinese. And has historically been either completely overlooked or overshadowed or neglected. And that was one of the reasons why we started the Railroad Workers Project, to recover that history some 8 years ago or so. Now, the challenges of the railroad were different, and I can talk more about them, but you go through the Great Plains on the eastern part, but coming in California and into Nevada and Utah, you encounter the enormous barrier of the Sierra Nevada mountain range, the high deserts and plateaus of Nevada and Utah. And the weather conditions and working conditions were abominable. The fact that these railroad lines were completed is a testament to engineering and also the stamina and the sacrifice of the workers. Now, this is just, I could spend a whole lecture just on this fascinating graphic here, which was completed in 1868 before Promontory Summit. It was a graphic painting done by a female artist, actually, her name is Fanny Farmer, and published in 1868. And you can see how the railroad, even at that time, piqued the curiosity and imagination of the American public, white American public, and what it symbolized in so many different ways. So you can see over here, native peoples left literally in the smoke of the railroad going from east to west. Right here, you can't really see it. It does say through line New York, San Francisco. This is the open spaces, beautiful, inviting resources of the West, and the railroad line replacing the covered wagon route, which resulted in these small little towns, Cheyenne and others along the way, railroad towns that became infamous. They were called at the time, in less glamorous terms, hell on wheels. They were hellholes because they were so degraded in human behavior. But here, this was the romantic notion of people working here, nuclear families starting up, the public school, and the railroad replacing the Indian, which would be replaced forever, they believed, and going out to the west. So that has been the notion, that has been the popular conception of the railroad, of the symbol of manifest destiny and the power of national accomplishment and union just a few years after the end of the Civil War, symbolized also by this famous photo, which may be the most famous photo from the certainly 19th century, of the meeting of East and West at Promontory Summit on May 10th, 1869, where you have the Central Pacific and Union Pacific meeting each other and the engineers shaking hands. And it's assumed that all these are the workers, but in fact, they were not workers. Most of them were gawkers. They'd come up from Salt Lake City or other towns to see this festivities marking the end of the completion of the line itself. But this has caused all sorts of controversy because many Chinese Americans feel that the photograph was as a grievous insult to them because there are no Chinese depicted in the photo, and people believe that this is a photo of the workers, and you can see almost all just white workers, and that somehow the Chinese were erased from the story. Now, it's also, this railroad is also highlighted with, because of the glitz and glamour of the famous golden spike, which was used in the ceremony in 1869 and tapped into place by Leland Stanford, who was the president of the Central Pacific Railroad. And this resides in the Stanford Museum. And if you're ever out in Stanford, you can go take a look at it. It sits there in the case, cleans away, and is inscribed with these words on here about the Pacific Railroad, which is what it was called. We called it Transcontinental Railroad because it linked existing lines to the Pacific, and so we called it the Pacific Railroad. It's also more memorialized in old style history books, such as this was the early biography of Leland Stanford, the founder of Stanford, who pays my salary. But you can see this kind of hero worship of the great man and the great men, the so-called Big Four, who were the leaders of the Central Pacific Railroad, Leland Stanford, Collis Huntington. You can see on the upper right in the square, he was the founder of the Huntington clan of great wealth in Southern California and New York. Charles Crocker and Mark Hopkins, known as the Big Four, which were legendary in California and Western history, all became enormously wealthy because of the railroad. And it was the wealth that they accumulated, Leland Stanford accumulated, that was the basis of the university, which you can see here. Well, it's also memorialized, and again, this is emphasis on talking about how history is written and misused. And this is a large painting at the California State Railroad Museum that also memorializes, called The Driving of the Last Spike in 1880, which is, the painting was completed in 1881, but this looks back on the 1869 events. And it depicts this event in such a way in which places Leland Stanford in the center of the painting, and all sorts of other dignitaries and people gathered around him, but the eye is drawn immediately to him, and he's the great man in the center of this. And there are some workers here, literally on their knees before the great man. A couple of women here, but almost all men, and perhaps a native person here. But again, echoes the same kind of vision of the March Across the Continent painting. Now, this painting really is a fake painting. The painting is not fake, but the depiction is fake, because it never happened. This scene never took place. Leland Stanford never stood like this. This was never an assembly of gathering of people such as this. And we know this because next to the painting, which is about the size of a billboard, there is a key to the portraits, as you can see here. So it names, the artist identifies a number of the people here and here. But you'll see right here the name T.D. Judah. And T.D. Judah, as I said, is the Judah who died in Panama around 1861, 1860. So he's not around, but he's inserted into the painting. And there are others who were not at the event, but this is what we call a hagiography, a celebration, a romantic celebration of certain events. Now, what is further was interesting is that the painting is based upon a photograph, much less well known. It was the same photographer who took the meeting of East and West photo, who took this photo. And this photo, you can see how the artist used the composition of the photograph to for his painting. So you have the engines coming this way, the tracks coming this way, the buckets on the ground over here. But instead of Leland Stanford laying the last rail, what you see, it was the historical truth, which was the Chinese are laying the last rail. And yet in the painting, they're absent. They're just sort of over here, passive. And you have all this right here. You have the telephone wires and all this. So you can see this photograph is really the inspiration of the painting, but the painting rewrites history. And this photograph is much less well known, even though A.J. Russell, the photographer, said that this was he engraved it as the caption of Chinese laying the last rail. And this picture on the right here, lower left, is 50 years later after this time. And the caption, this was a 50th anniversary celebration of this event. And it said that these three guys were part of the crew that laid the last rail. Well, I won't talk about the background of the Transcontinental Railroad, although it had been an aspiration and ambition for many years, decades before the 1860s, but then was able to be realized because of the outbreak of the Civil War and the opposition of the South to a northern route ended because of secession, and the North was able to proceed with the construction of the rail line. The South, for years, blocked this because they wanted the rail line to swing through the South, and therefore unite the South in a way that the northern line united the North. Well, at the time, as I said, the Chinese railroad workers composed something like 90% of the portion of the labor force on the western half of the Transcontinental. And it was widely recognized. Their contribution was widely recognized. This was no secret at the time. We gathered all sorts of newspaper reports, and we read things such as this from the newly founded Scientific American. And they acknowledged the contributions of the Chinese, the incredible work that they completed, the skills, their industry, and also not just their muscle and bone, but also their skills in building the railroad, which required considerable engineering skills at the time, construction skills, carpentry, masonry, use of dynamite or explosives, and the moving of earth and stone, massive amounts. So there are pictures of this that show Chinese. This is a famous photo here. And with an enlargement, you can see there are hundreds of Chinese in this area over here and over here who are bringing down dirt and gravel and bringing it to make this fill this is called a Secret Town Trestle. And this was a gap here. They built a trestle and you're fill in with dirt, massive amounts of dirt to accommodate the line, which the engineers wanted to be as straight as possible and as in elevation as not as steep as possible. So that because you'd have to think about how railroads operate. And there was also, besides of the terrain, the challenge of weather. And the Central Pacific, in its quest to lay as much track as possible in as quick amount of time, because the railroad companies received stipends, support, subsidy from the federal government, money as well as land that was given to them for every mile of track that they laid. So they were as an incentive for each company to lay as much track as possible in as quick amount of time to get that subsidy, but also to control as much of the completed line as possible. So they would accrue more money, more profits from carrying passengers and freight longer distances. So the Central Pacific had that enormous challenge of getting through the winter Sierra through the winters, and they had to work through the winters, and that included tunneling, clearing the snow for the line, working in blizzards and working in blinding snow. Many of you know the snow country, and you can't go outside without glasses, goggles, because it's so brilliant when the sun hits the snow. In fact, it seemed that two of the worst conditions, some of the conditions that the Chinese most feared, and actually also the supervisors feared. One of them was mud, was rain and mud. Can you try to imagine working with horses and heavy equipment in mud that would just stick to everything? And you couldn't move through that. Snow was actually easier to navigate because you could put sleds and this type of thing. But snow in like this was was fearsome because of snow slides. I mean, there was the glare from the snow, they had to go out and find goggles for the workers. But snow slides would come down and sweep away scores of workers in these terrible slides. And then you had the explosions from the dynamite or gunpowder, black powder that went off accidentally. So there were lots of difficult, terrible dangers. And it's estimated that something like 1,200 Chinese died in the building of their portion of the railroad. Now, I'm going to show you a number of photos, which I love historical photos. I think many of us do, give a sense of a very different place removed from us. But these were photos taken by a photographer hired by the Central Pacific to document or to kind of photograph the Central Pacific, the company's work. They were used to raise capital back in the East, to show you the magnificent countryside of California and Nevada and Utah, to audiences who never seen the West before. So these were very important photos in introducing visually the West to Eastern populations. And in many of these photos, you can see Chinese in them. Now, the photographer didn't have the aim of documenting Chinese, but they just sort of appear in a lot of these. Something like this photo here, which this fellow at the bottom is inserted to give you some sense of the scale of the machinery that was used. Now, it turns out that this snowplow was unusable because of the snow depth. You could see on both sides, he just couldn't move snow of that depth. And that's why they had to use manual labor, shovels and picks to get the snow off of the track so that the line could run and to go further in construction. It would show these incredible scenes of the heights of the Sierra. This is still in the foothills of the Sierra, not the high Sierra yet. Looking down, this was a famous location as they looked down where the line had to thread around these mountain outcroppings. You can see photos such as this. Now, the scale of the work is really quite staggering. This was a mountain here. It was taken down to clear the way for the roadbed. And what we did, and this was the advantage of digital technology, is get very high resolutions of these photos and study them closely. No one really took the time to study these photos closely before. But I took a look at these, and you can see right in here a handful, maybe 40, 50 workers still working. But this is really the aftermath of the work of hundreds of workers. And you can see them in digital enlargement. They're Chinese, and they've been tasked with doing this heavy work. Now, these photos have a static quality to them because these are glass plate photos, and they didn't take photos of moving things, objects, people very well. So the photos, most of them are from a distance like this, and they have people stationary in most cases, including like this, another big fill where they use workers, and it was all hand work, horses and carts and picks and shovels and black powder for explosion, but no power tools, as we would call them. It's all hand work, including the laying of the track. And going through the very dense forests of this of California, such as this. Again, all this done through hard rock, done with by hand. From 1860, Chinese were hired around 1864, and they worked for 5 years through the end of 1869, although many workers continued on the Transcontinental, on the Central Pacific Railroad and Union Pacific afterwards. So you can imagine what labor it took to do this project. Now, some of the photos are quite attractive. They're quite pretty. They're almost art photos, such as this one taken up in the High Sierra on the eastern slope of the west of the Sierra. And you see actually several Chinese here. One guy with water cans on a shoulder pole. This is an alpine pond to get water, and there was a labor camp apparently nearby. And then there's a couple of fellows here which kind of fade into the background. One guy looks like a butcher or a cook. He's got an apron on, and this guy is, I don't know what he is. He's got silks on. Maybe he's a gambler or something like this. There were all sorts of different Chinese who worked out there along the lines. And at its high point, there may have been 12,000 Chinese at any one point, at any one time, working on the line, and some 20,000 possibly in total because of turnover. They had to build these imposing retaining walls, such as this, again to hold up the rail line, to make it as straight and as level as possible. And again, you can see all the labor, that the workers there with the carts, and just dumping load after load of broken rock down into these ravines to shore up the roadbed. And this is a famous photo here, which shows a Chinese tea carrier. Chinese drank lots of tea because they came from southern China, and it was their custom to drink. It was pretty healthy for them to drink lots of water along the way to keep hydrated. And in the background is a tunnel, one of the 15 tunnels that were blasted through solid granite for the rail line. Other pictures such as this, I'm going to go through these more quickly here. Unfortunately, they lived in labor camps outside in the open air, maybe a couple hundred here in this labor camp. White workers and supervisors lived in the camp train in the background, where they had their meals and bunk beds and so forth. The Chinese lived outside. Other photos, you can see them breaking down the granite for use for the roadbed and for the retaining walls. And this was the astounding photo of the largest tunnel, some 1,600 feet long, I think it was, through solid granite. There was no framing necessary for the tunnel. That is, no wood or structure to hold up the dirt, because there's no dirt. It's all just solid rock, as you can see, and it hasn't even broken through to the other end. It took 2 years to get through this tunnel. And then they break into Nevada, now you have, instead of the cold winters, you have the blistering summers. And this was the photo, one of the few photos that showed them a little more clearly of what the workers looked like. This was actually a staged photo some months after Promontory by the photographer who was trying promo for his own work. There were lots of people who died, as I said, maybe 1,200. This is a photo of a cemetery, not of the railroad workers, but later on, the Chinese spread out throughout the West into Idaho, into Utah. This was a rare photo we found of a funeral up in Idaho. We used quickly more historical work, payroll records. We find the names of names of Chinese who worked on the railroad, although a lot of the payroll records were lost and burned. And many of the Chinese were not named in these because they were contracted workers. They did not work directly for the Central Pacific. The Central Pacific hired labor contractors who hired the Chinese. So there's a separation between the workers and the company that we can't recover. But we did identify scores of Chinese Americans today who are very proud of their genealogy, that many of them know that they came from railroad workers. So the Chinese railroad workers were really the backbone of what became Chinese America, including authors such as Maxine Hong Kingston, who's down in the lower left here, whose great grandfather was a railroad worker. So people have all sorts of information or stories about the railroads handed down through their families. And we also worked with archaeologists, who was fascinating work where they followed the route of the Transcontinental and discovered thousands of pieces of garbage and bowls and clothing pieces and metal pipes and all sorts of things left behind by the workers as they moved along in those labor camps. And these were traced back the origins to southern China with the decorations and the type of clay and firing and so forth. So we know they came all the way from near Hong Kong all the way to the American West. You can things such as this is up in near Donner Lake in the Truckee Museum. Along the way, people can still see fire pits such as this, where these camps were 150 years ago. Sometime this probably held a big walks and cast iron cookingware. There's still clear evidence of their work, such as this huge retaining wall that's completed using just fitted stone. There's no mortar that holds this thing together. It's held together for more than 150 years, and it'll just probably be there for another 150 years. But this is where the rail line used to run on top of this. This is probably, to get some sense of the scale, a 6-foot person would be about this tall right there. And then in May 2019, I came out to join the 150th anniversary of the completion of the rail line in May 2019, and went out to some of the areas where the workers lived and worked. And this is what the scenery looks like. This is probably familiar to you. It's not far away from BYU. It's closer to Promontory Summit in Salt Lake City, but this should be familiar terrain. But you can try to imagine living and working out in this area. So these are areas that are no longer in use. The railroad line was built and rebuilt many times, but this was still some of the areas that were identified as being part of the original route. And even along these routes, this is just right now, you can see all these remnants, what's called material culture that the workers left behind right on the surface of the ground, where archaeologists, you think of people digging down, but they also find stuff just right on the surface. And they were trying to understand what's called this material culture. You can see all these bottles, shards of broken porcelain, ceramics, rice bowls, such as this, and clearly of Chinese design. So again, evidence of their presence a long time ago. Well, I'll just end with showing these 2 books that came out of our project. This one is a scholarly volume of about 21 essays. And this is the book that I authored that gives sort of a narrative story. And I direct you to it and hope that you take a look at it, giving us sort of a beginning to the end account of the Chinese participation in the building of the Transcontinental Railroad. So I will stop here. We have some time, and we would love to hear your comments or questions or about what we've talked about here.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Chang. That was an extremely interesting lecture, and a lot of those terrific photos. I agree. I love looking at those and hearing more about them. We do already have a few questions coming through in the chat. We'll invite any of you who have questions also to submit them to me that way. Let me begin with some questions from Raymond Lee here. He has a couple of questions that sort of, I guess, in a way of a background here to this story. And so I'm just going to read what he wrote. Historically, for millennia, China insulated itself off from the world, relatively speaking. What attracted men from China to go build a railroad in a country that was foreign to them in almost every sense? And then secondarily, what did the Chinese government think of the citizens who left to build a railroad in another country?
Well, it's a good question. I respond in a couple of ways. One, I think it's a misconception to say that China was isolated from the rest of the world, for one. For most of its history, China was very much connected to other civilizations and cultures in East Asia, Southeast Asia, and what we would call the Middle East. The connection between Persia, ancient Persia, and China is legendary and mutually beneficial in terms of cultural exchange and understanding. Both benefit greatly. And China was called, as some of you know, mistakenly sort of translated as the Middle Kingdom. But that indicates the centrality of China actually in the Far East, being a core of a contact for many other people. So it became known as sort of isolated, largely because of the arrival of Western forces beginning roughly in the 15th and 16th century, and then with increasing aggressiveness that the Chinese government did want to restrict the activities of Westerners, Europeans. And that's where I think most of the belief of China being isolated, walled off, symbolized by the Great Wall, came to be. So that's that. I wouldn't want to say that. Now, about the people who did leave later on, did leave from a country that was more walled off from outside contact because of the intrusion and the fear of Western intrusion and influences into the country. That's more in the 19th century. But the Chinese workers who left drew on a long tradition, several hundred long tradition of leaving southern China. They all came from a rather localized portion of southern China to go to Southeast Asia, to the Philippines, to Thailand, Indonesia, and tens of thousands did over many years. So there was a pattern of migration, of a southward migration. Now, when North America opens up, then in some ways you could say that this was a continuation of that flow of workers who had left China, but now going to a new place, going to Canada and North America, Hawaii, Peru, and all the way to the Caribbean, where the Chinese wound up. So Chinese in the 19th century just spread all around the world. And they did so because of the devastation of southern China from the wars. There's two so-called opium wars, other wars engaged with the foreign powers that China lost all of these wars and became quite destitute after being a great empire, becoming quite poor. So conditions for people in China really declined, particularly in southern China, near Hong Kong area. And you also had the proximity of Hong Kong, which was under the British, and Macau, which is under the Portuguese, as ports from which the Chinese could leave. Now, those were important because officially, Chinese were not to leave the country. They did not want people leaving the country. For one reason was they feared people leaving the country and then coming back and becoming disorderly and bringing back, and there was a whole history of exiles coming back after being abroad and were rebels and come back into the country, and they didn't want that kind of pattern to continue. But the Chinese who went from southern China came from a rather isolated portion of southern China and were attracted by the opportunities in Canada for gold and North America for wage work. Wage work was rare in southern China. And then others in a much worse condition were taken in a semi-slave condition to places such as Cuba, sometimes for a while in Hawaii, but in Peru, where they were really indentured and suffered considerably. So there was a wide variety of conditions under which Chinese labored and going outside of the country. But many of them returned because they did find success. They did find gold and opportunity in North America or Australia, New Zealand later on. in return with great tales of success. And even though they were a small number of, they fueled people's imagination.
Oh, thank you. That's yeah, very interesting. All right, we have a question from Daniel. Daniel, if you'd like to unmute yourself and ask your question, please.
Yeah, I was just wondering your thoughts on more modern refugees like the Hmong people, or even more recently the Korean refugees from Asia, and how they've become part of the American experience, but a lot of people don't even know they're here anymore or have never heard of them, and what your thoughts are and what we should do, or if we should do anything.
Well, a good question and heartfelt. I appreciate your concern, and I think their plight, their situation should be given much more attention. But part of it, especially with the Hmong and even among Vietnamese Americans, they are a result of a euphemism, a sad time in American history, the Vietnam War era, and it's a very touchy subject. It's hardly touched on in certainly in high schools or even in colleges. I don't think we've had a course on the Vietnam War at Stanford for years. I used to teach one, but it's just sort of dropped out, even though it was such a pivotal moment in American history. So, but then the Hmong and Vietnamese and others are reminders, I would say, and are here in a very different circumstance than other immigrant groups who came largely voluntarily. The Hmong were refugees and others. They had to escape from Laos or from the Cambodians because of terrible things there. The Hmong, many of them were connected to, were very anti-communist in their home country and were connected to the CIA, and the CIA and the Hmong wanted to get out because it was dangerous for them after the end of the war, and so they came here, but largely, not because they wanted to, but because of the circumstances. So they've had a different kind of challenge than, say, the immigrants who come from South Korea or Taiwan or Hong Kong or the Philippines more recently. We'd say their profile is a little more similar to the historical profile of immigrants who come to America. I hope that answers your question. Or you want to follow up, Daniel?
No, that was great. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Daniel. We now have a question from Abish. Abish, do you want to unmute yourself and ask your question?
Yeah, so my question was about how the photos were received. Like, what were the general reactions to both the West and to the Chinese railroad workers?
Well, a good question. The photos were very well received in that they were such curiosities that you try to, what I love about history, and some of you are history students, and is that it prompts, when we think about history, we can be, try to transport ourselves and to place ourselves, and that's one way to really think about history, place ourselves back 150 years ago in Boston or in Charleston, South Carolina, or New Orleans or Chicago or somewhere. I mean, these places were so distant from the far West, that these photos were just shocking to people, to see the immense, the mountains, the height of those mountains, their ruggedness. Some of you, I remember when I went to college in the East Coast, and I remember the first year I was out there, I went to Vermont to go skiing with friends or just to see the countryside. And I said, these are mountains? I mean, these are sort of hills. So we would call them in California hills. And the skiing was so different than what one can enjoy in, Colorado, Utah, California, and Wyoming. I mean, those are we have real mountains and real weather. So seeing those snowdrifts, seeing those cliffs, seeing those rivers was really shocking. And then trying to imagine the people back east, imagine what it would take to push a line through them, through that terrain, was staggering. So people talked a lot about this, and they had paintings and drawings and stories about this. And the Far West, it was still would take weeks to get out to the Far West, but there were intrepid visitors who would go out and make their way, and there were journalists who reported on these things because there was such a curiosity, such a thirst, a hunger to know about the building of this railroad, which was just such an imposing challenge, and then the conditions. And so California and the Far West, we're all part, you are part of the Far West too, are still quite prominent, I think, in the American imagination of those in the East Coast. And our conditions are so different from those in, say, Virginia, or Ohio, or Alabama.
Thank you, Avish. A question from Daisy. She wanted me to ask. She's just interested, what sparked your interest in this subject, in the Transcontinental Railroad? Seemed like it was a subject that was not well known before you began your project. So what sparked your?
Thank you for the question. Good question, Daisy. I'm a fourth generation Californian. I trace my lineage back at least to the 1850s in California. And growing up in the Oakland area where I did, I'd sort of always heard about Chinese railroad workers from relatives and a little bit in some storybooks, but there was virtually no history book. There's nothing really written about them. So I had always was curious about their history, but wanted to know more and couldn't find it. So when I went to graduate school, one of the first things I did many years ago, actually, thank you for the introduction. My PhD was from Stanford, not from Harvard. But when I went to Stanford to get my PhD in history, one of the first things I did, I went to the Stanford Special Collections to see if I could find Leland Stanford's papers about the railroad and see what I could learn about Chinese railroad workers from those papers. But there weren't many papers. The family, Jane Stanford, destroyed the vast bulk of his archive. They didn't want secrets to get out. And there was just very, very little. So it took a long time, many years, before I was able to have the space and time to be able to engage the project. So it was a long-standing curiosity. And this was something, one of the fundamental topics of interest among Chinese Americans. So in some ways, it was not a surprise to undertake this, but it took a long time to get to that point where I could.
Thank you. Okay, well, we know that we've lost a number of people, that some of you will have to leave if you have a 1 o'clock class. But let's at least finish up here. Eric Heyer, our Asian Studies coordinator, also has a question. So Eric, please ask yours.
Sure. Professor Chang, that was very interesting. I'm so happy that students have this opportunity to learn a little about what for Utah is actually even kind of local history for us. I was struck by the slide you had from the Scientific Americana. And this kind of brings us up to the contemporary. There was sort of the way they described the Chinese was both in sort of positive terms and in kind of negative terms. They said their industry was unflagging, and Asian Americans are just hardworking people. They're good-tempered. They don't fly into rages and things like that. But then it mentioned that they have a docile disposition. So it seems to me that Asians have this kind of schizophrenic personality. They're docile, but they're hardworking. They're good-tempered. And that kind of plagues the Asian American community even today, and almost makes them targets of bullying and things like that.
Well, you're right on the mark. I mean, you're a very perceptive reading of that, and it helps me remind me of that interpretation, which actually I just wrote about. I just published an opinion piece in which I focus exactly on that issue, that Chinese, one of the conditions of Chinese is that they're seen as, I don't use the term docile, but powerless, weak, won't or cannot react, and therefore are targets to being picked on. And so there's this sense of passivity which plagues Asian Americans. And thus, if you can attack Asian Americans, you're not going to have problems because they're just not going to fight back. And it's wrong morally as well as factually. But you can see that this is a historical kind of legacy that Asian Americans today have. The Asians are not going to fight back.
Thanks.
Oh, yeah. Okay. Well, very interesting. It is the 1 o'clock hour now. And so we'll just end. If you were here on campus, Professor Chang, we would have a very loud, rousing round of applause for you. So we'll just have to do that virtually. And hopefully at some point in the future, when the pandemic is over, maybe we could invite you to campus. But we really appreciate your taking the time, sharing this fascinating work with us. And it's what has been a neglected part of American history and Chinese American history.
Thank you, Professor Benfeld. Thank you all for being a great audience. I wish I could have been there and see you. I do miss being able to speak to audiences in person, but I wish you all well, stay healthy, and let's get through all this crisis.